This was supposed to be an ordinary day in an American courtroom. The judge had already seen many cases, many arguments, and many people asking for justice. The lawyers sat with their files. The audience waited in silence, and the air felt heavy with routine seriousness. But deep inside that room, something felt unusual. It was as if the walls themselves were waiting for something unexpected. No one knew that in just a few moments, this quiet courtroom would witness a story no one would ever forget. A story not about a famous lawyer, not about a rich family, but about a small boy who had come carrying pain, courage, and the truth. Then the large wooden courtroom doors slowly opened. At first, nobody paid attention. But as the sound echoed across the room, people began to turn their heads. Standing in the doorway was not a lawyer, not a police officer, and not a witness. It was a small boy, no older than 10 years old. He looked nervous, but he did not turn back. He stepped forward carefully, holding an old file tightly against his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping him strong. The room instantly changed. People stared in confusion, wondering why a child had come into court alone. Whispers began spreading through the courtroom. Some people leaned toward each other and quietly asked questions. Others simply stared. This was not normal. Children did not walk into court alone, and they certainly did not stand in the center of a courtroom carrying legal papers. The boy looked small compared to the huge room around him, but there was something in his eyes that made people pause. He looked afraid, yes, but he also looked determined. It was a kind of determination that comes from pain, the kind that makes someone walk into a place they should never have had to enter in the first place. At the front of the room, the judge finally looked up from his papers. His face remained calm, but his eyes sharpened the moment he saw the child. He had handled difficult cases for years, but this was something entirely different. The boy stood there alone, no parent beside him, no attorney next to him, no hand on his shoulder for comfort. For a long second, the judge said nothing. He simply studied the child's face, the shaking hands, the worn clothes, and the file clutched close to his chest. The entire courtroom went silent, waiting for the first words that would define what happened next. The judge leaned forward slightly and finally spoke. His voice was firm, but not cruel. He asked the question everyone in that room was already thinking. "Where's your lawyer?" The words echoed in the silence. For a moment, it felt like the entire courtroom stopped breathing. People expected the child to point toward someone in the back, or maybe say that an adult was on the way. But the boy didn't either. He just stood there, swallowing his fear, trying to find the courage to answer. What came next would surprise everyone in that room. The boy lifted his chin, even though his hands were trembling. His voice was soft, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I don't have a lawyer, Your Honor," he said. Then he took a small breath and added, "I will speak for myself." The words hit the courtroom like a wave. Some people looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. A few even seemed heartbroken. A child was standing in open court, ready to fight his own case. It was not something anyone had expected to see. But what stood before them was not just fear. It was courage shaped by suffering. The judge remained silent for a long moment. He could have stopped this immediately. He could have told the child to come back with an adult, or refused to continue. But there was something in the boy's face that made him hesitate. It was not rebellion. It was not childish stubbornness. It was grief, honesty, and desperate courage. Finally, the judge nodded slowly and told the boy he would be allowed to speak. The courtroom shifted again. What had begun as confusion was now turning into attention. Everyone realized this was no ordinary case. With shaking fingers, the boy opened the old file he'd been holding so tightly. The papers inside were worn, bent at the edges, and marked by time. He carefully pulled out medical bills, letters, work forms, and handwritten notes. Each page looked like it had been read over and over again. He had not walked into that courtroom empty-handed. He had come prepared. Not like a trained lawyer, but like someone who had spent nights trying to understand pain through paperwork. Every document told part of the story, and together they began to reveal why this child had come to court alone. The boy looked at the judge and began telling his story. He said his father had worked hard every day, often leaving home before sunrise and returning after dark. He was not a rich man. He was not powerful. But he was honest, and he loved his son deeply. The boy said his father always smiled even when he was exhausted, and he always promised that hard work would give them a better life someday. As the child spoke, the courtroom listened in complete silence. This was no longer just about legal papers. It was becoming a human story. Then the boy described the day everything changed. His father came home earlier than usual, but something was wrong. He was quiet, pale, and unlike himself. The child said he had never seen his father look that way before. That was the day his father lost his job. No warning, no fairness, no dignity. Just a man sent home with nothing but silence and worry. The boy explained that from that day forward, their home changed. The laughter became less frequent. The bills began piling up. Fear entered the house and refused to leave. That was the beginning of the pain that brought the child to court. The boy continued, saying that after losing his job, his father's health began to fail. At first it seemed like stress, the kind adults try to hide from children. But then came the weakness, the coughing, the sleepless nights, and the hospital visits. The boy said he watched his father become smaller and quieter with every passing week. He wanted to help, but he was just a child. All he could do was sit nearby, listen, and pray. The courtroom remained completely still as he described the helplessness of watching the strongest person in his life slowly break down. He said the hospital became a second home. The bright lights, the cold walls, the quiet machines, and the smell of medicine became part of his everyday life. He would sit beside his father's bed for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just holding his hand in silence. His father would still try to smile, even through pain, because he did not want his son to be afraid. But children notice more than adults think. The boy noticed the fear in his father's eyes. He noticed the struggle in every breath. And he knew, even before he understood the words, that their time together was slipping away. Then the boy reached the hardest part of his story. One day, he said, the machines sounded different. Nurses moved more quickly. Doctors spoke in low voices. He held his father's hand and waited for him to open his eyes again. But he never did. The boy's voice almost broke as he explained that in that moment, he lost not just a parent, but the only person who had always stood between him and the world. A deep silence filled the courtroom. Even people who had entered as strangers now felt the weight of the child's loss. The boy wiped his eyes and told the judge that he did not come to court because he wanted pity. He came because he wanted the truth to be heard. He believed his father had been treated unfairly, and that losing his job had pushed their life into tragedy. He knew he could not bring his father back, but he also knew he could not stay silent. He said he had spent many nights reading through papers he barely understood, trying to connect every piece of the story. He came to court because no one else was left to fight for his father, so he decided to do it himself. Across the courtroom, the company's lawyer sat listening. At first, he appeared calm, almost unaffected. To him, this may have seemed like an emotional story with no real legal power behind it. He adjusted his tie, glanced at the papers, and looked toward the judge with quiet confidence. But what he did not understand was that the boy had not come prepared with just feelings. He had brought evidence. He had brought dates, signatures, forms, and records. And most of all, he had brought a kind of truth that people can feel before they can even explain it. The boy placed several documents before the court and explained each one as best as he could. He showed employment records, hospital bills, written notices, and notes his father had kept. He spoke slowly, sometimes stumbling over legal terms, but he never stopped. It was clear he had studied every page. The judge listened closely, asking careful questions, and the boy answered with surprising clarity. Each paper added another layer to the case. The audience could now see that this child had not entered by accident. He had come with purpose. And with every page he revealed, the boy told the court how he prepared for this day. After school, after crying, after trying to survive the silence of his empty home, he would sit under a dim lamp and read whatever he could. He searched through papers, copied questions into notebooks, and practiced speaking out loud when no one was around. Sometimes he did not understand the words, but he kept going anyway. He had no teacher, no legal guide, and no one to tell him he was doing it right. He only had memory, grief, and determination. The courtroom began to realize that this case had already taken more courage than most adults could imagine. Then came the moment that changed everything. The boy turned toward the company's lawyer and asked a simple question about the dates on one of the dismissal documents. It sounded small at first, but when the lawyer hesitated, the room felt it immediately. The boy asked again, this time pointing to another paper that showed a conflicting timeline. The lawyer shifted in his seat. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. The child had found something important. It was not just emotion anymore. It was contradiction. And contradiction has a dangerous way of pulling hidden truth into the light. The lawyer tried to explain the discrepancy, but his confidence had clearly changed. His answer sounded polished, yet uncertain. The boy listened carefully, then presented another document that raised even more questions. The judge leaned forward, now fully engaged. The audience felt the tension rising with every second. What had started as a child's plea was becoming a serious challenge to the company's version of events. The lawyer spoke again, but this time even he seemed to know the courtroom could hear the weakness in his response. For the first time, the boy was no longer seen as helpless. He was being seen as credible. By now, the mood in the courtroom had completely changed. People who at first looked at the boy with pity were now looking at him with respect. The judge's attention had sharpened. Even the lawyer's expression had shifted from confidence to caution. The child stood there, small in size but huge in presence, holding together facts and pain with a steadiness that seemed impossible for someone his age. The room understood something important now. This boy was not here because he was confused. He was here because he knew something was wrong, and he had come to make sure the truth could no longer hide. Then the boy reached into the old file and slowly pulled out something different. It was not a bill. It was not a legal form. It was a handwritten letter from his father. The paper was slightly wrinkled, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. The boy told the judge that his father had written it after losing his job. He said he had kept it safe ever since. The courtroom watched in complete silence as the child held that letter with both hands, like it was the last living piece of someone he loved. And in many ways, it was... The boy began reading the letter out loud. His voice trembled at first, but he kept going. In the letter, his father wrote about the pain of losing his job, the fear of not being able to provide, and the shame he felt bringing that burden home. He wrote that he was trying to stay strong for his son, even while everything inside him was collapsing. The child paused between lines, trying to keep his voice steady. The courtroom listened to every word. It no longer felt like a legal hearing. It felt like a man who could no longer speak had somehow returned to tell his side of the story. When the boy finished reading, the judge asked to see the letter himself. The child walked carefully toward the bench and handed it over with both hands. The judge took the paper and read it in silence. No one in the courtroom moved. The audience watched his expression, hoping to read something in his face, but he remained composed. Still, the weight of the moment was obvious. This was more than evidence. It was testimony written by a man whose life had been broken before it ended. The boy stood quietly, waiting, as though his entire world depended on what the judge would see in that page. The judge read every line slowly. His eyes moved carefully across the paper, and for the first time, the courtroom could see that this was affecting him deeply. He did not interrupt. He did not speak. He simply read. The silence stretched longer and longer, and no one dared break it. In that stillness, the child's case felt stronger than ever. The father's pain was no longer something explained by others. It was there in his own words, written with the honesty of someone who knew his world was falling apart. The judge placed the letter down gently, as if it deserved respect. After the judge finished reading, the boy turned back toward the company's lawyer and asked another question. This time, it was not about emotion. It was about dates, signatures, and timing. He pointed to the dismissal papers and asked why the records did not match the timeline shown in the other documents. The lawyer began to answer, but his confidence was weaker now. The boy calmly referred to a second sheet, then a third. Each one tightened the pressure. The courtroom could feel the change. What started as a brave child speaking from grief had become a real legal challenge built on careful detail. The company's lawyer adjusted his posture and tried to regain control. He responded with polished language, legal phrases, and an attempt to make the contradiction sound unimportant. But the room could feel something had changed. His words were still sharp, yet they no longer sounded certain. The boy did not interrupt. He waited until the lawyer finished, then quietly referred back to the documents again. It was that calmness that made the difference. One person was trying to protect a position. The other was simply trying to protect the truth. And in a courtroom, people can feel that difference more than anyone expects. The judge leaned forward now, no longer watching as a distant referee. He was fully engaged. He looked again at the documents, then at the boy, then toward the lawyer. It was clear that he understood the seriousness of what was unfolding. The courtroom felt smaller somehow, tighter, as if every person had been pulled into the same moment of focus. The boy had done something extraordinary. He had made the judge stop seeing him as only a child and start seeing him as the bearer of a serious claim. That change in perception transformed the room. Then the boy pulled out one final document. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but its importance became clear the moment he explained it. It connected the dismissal timeline, the internal company notice, and the beginning of his father's medical collapse. The paper did not prove everything by itself, but it tied the entire story together in a way that made the company's explanation far weaker. The boy placed it before the judge with steady hands. The lawyer looked down. The audience did not move. The weight of the whole courtroom seemed to rest on that single sheet of paper. The judge asked the lawyer to respond to the final document. For a brief moment, the lawyer seemed caught between explanation and silence. He began speaking, but the words sounded weaker than before. He pointed to procedure, to interpretation, to technical language, but none of it carried the same force now. The child had not outshouted him. He had simply outlasted him with truth. The courtroom could hear the difference. The boy stood still, his eyes fixed on the bench, while the lawyer's answers slowly lost their power. It was becoming clear that the truth had moved beyond defense. In the center of the courtroom, the boy stood completely alone. No attorney whispered advice. No adult stood beside him for protection. And yet, in that moment, he looked stronger than anyone else in the room. He had brought every part of himself into the open. The fear, the grief, the preparation, the memory of his father, and the truth he refused to let die. There's a powerful kind of strength that comes from having nothing left to hide. The courtroom could see it now. They were not just looking at a child anymore. They were looking at courage in its purest form. 31. The judge said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the documents, then at the boy, then down again. That silence became enormous. No one in the courtroom moved. Even the air seemed heavy. Silence in a courtroom can mean uncertainty, caution, or thought. But this silence felt like something else. It felt like the exact moment when truth stops being something argued and becomes something recognized. The boy waited motionless, his entire future balanced in the space between one breath and the next. The courtroom had reached the edge of decision. Finally, the judge straightened the paper before him and looked up. Every eye in the room locked onto him. The lawyer sat rigid. The audience barely breathed. The boy stood still, gripping the edge of his file. The judge began speaking slowly, carefully, with the kind of voice that makes a whole room listen harder. He said the court had reviewed the evidence with seriousness. He said the case was not merely about process, but about fairness, consequence, and responsibility. As he continued, everyone understood the same thing. The verdict was beginning, and everything was about to change. Then the judge said the words that changed everything. He ruled in favor of the boy. For a heartbeat, the courtroom seemed unable to react. The words hung in the air, powerful and unreal. The judge acknowledged the evidence, the contradictions, and the painful chain of events that had been brought before the court. He recognized the truth the child had fought so hard to make visible. The boy did not move at first. It was as if his mind needed time to catch up with what his heart had been begging for all along. Justice had finally answered. The courtroom reacted all at once, but not loudly. Some people gasped. Others covered their mouths. A few lowered their heads as tears filled their eyes. The lawyer sat in silence, no longer defensive, no longer certain. The boy stood there, caught between shock and release, holding onto the old file as if it were the only solid thing in the room. He had entered carrying fear and pain, but now something else was spread into the courtroom. Respect. He had not won because he was louder. He had won because he had refused to let the truth disappear. Tears filled the boy's eyes, and this time he did not try to hide them. These were not the tears of helplessness from lonely nights or hospital chairs. These were tears of release, tears of being heard, tears of knowing that his father's story had not ended in silence after all. For so long, he had carried pain like something heavy and invisible. Now, for the first time, that burden shifted. The truth had not brought his father back, but it had restored something just as important in that moment, dignity, recognition, and peace. Before the courtroom could fully settle, the judge looked directly at the boy and spoke to him not just as a legal authority, but as a man speaking to courage. He told the child that what he had done took extraordinary strength. He said many adults would not have had the bravery to stand alone and speak with such honesty. The boy listened through tears, saying nothing. He did not need to. In that moment, the courtroom had become more than a place of judgment. It had become a place where truth was recognized and courage was honored. The room felt different now. The people who had first looked at the child with confusion were now looking at him with deep respect. The lawyer sat quietly. The audience no longer whispered. The silence had changed. It was no longer tense. It was meaningful. The boy stood in the center of it all, no taller than before, no older than before, yet transformed by what he had done. Respect can fill a room without making a sound. And in that courtroom, respect was everywhere, in the stillness, in the faces, and in the way no one needed words to understand what they had just witnessed. The boy lowered his eyes to the old file in his hands. It looked the same as when he first walked in, worn, bent, ordinary, and yet now it carried the weight of everything he had done. He had not come for revenge. He had not come just for compensation. He had come because he could not let his father's life be reduced to paperwork and silence. He wanted someone to see the man behind the records, the worker behind the signatures, the father behind the suffering. And now, finally, the world inside that courtroom had seen him. When the hearing ended, the boy turned toward the courtroom doors. He had walked into that room carrying fear, grief, and uncertainty. Now, he was walking out with something else. Not happiness exactly, not victory in the simple sense, but peace. The kind of peace that comes when someone you love is finally given the dignity they deserved. His steps were steadier now. The room watched him leave in silence, knowing they had seen something rare. A child had entered with trembling hands and walked out having changed the heart of a courtroom. Sometimes the world assumes that courage belongs only to the powerful, the wealthy, or the experienced. But that is not always true. Sometimes courage belongs to a child with trembling hands, a broken heart, and a reason too important to ignore. This boy had no lawyer. He had no power. He had no one standing beside him. But he had love, truth, and the strength to speak when silence would have been easier. And in the end, that was enough. Enough to be heard. Enough to defend his father's dignity. Enough to remind everyone that even the smallest voice can move justice when it speaks the truth.